Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Blavatskyhouse. Once a month we give a presentation in English here in the Blavatskyhouse. And this talk is also available on our website. So I would like to welcome all those who are watching us in Barcelona and in Brazil and in the United States and maybe in Australia and I don't know where. Welcome. We are going to discuss a very important topic this afternoon about life and death, about the perspective of life. And undoubtedly, you all have thought about this subject already, so you can see whether the Theosophical teachings match with your own ideas and whether Theosophy is able to answer the questions you may have. If you have any questions about this presentation, please, you may interrupt me. That make this talk more interesting for everybody. Well, the first part of this talk is about 50 minutes, 1 hour. Then there is a short break, and then there is the second part of this talk, and we will end this presentation about 4 o'clock, 4:15. Well, in preparation for this lecture, I was wondering, will I start with the dying process or with the birth process? The birth process may seem logical. After all, being born is the beginning of life and death is the end. But every beginning is the end of something else, and the end of something is the beginning of something new. In one of his songs, Bob Dylan wrote, "Who's not busy being born is busy dying." But we say, in fact, you are busy being born and busy dying at the same time. So dying is being born, and being born is dying. You cannot die without being born at the same time, and you cannot be born without dying. Compare it with appearing and disappearing. When you leave this room, you will appear in the hallway, you die, so to speak, in this room, and you will be born in the hallway. And to make it even clearer, you can die in one phase of life, and you will automatically be born in another phase. You die as a toddler, and will be born as a school child, and you die as a teenager, and you will be born as an adult. And then you die as a middle-aged person, and you are born as an elder one. These phases can also be called states of consciousness. The states of toddler, of teenager, and you go from one state to the other. In the processes of dying and being born, it's the same, and there are always transitions. You leave one state and move to another. Now, these processes progress gradually. You will not sleep as a teenager to be born as an adult in just one night. This is also the case with the process of dying. You go gradually from life to death. And to understand this process properly, you should ask yourself, what is it that dies? And what is it that is born at the same time? There must be something that goes from one state or one condition to the other. Something that makes that transition. Well, that's something that is you. That's the human being. And that something has many names in different religious traditions. Some speak of the soul, of the spirit, of the breath, or of Atman, or whatever name you want to give it. And we will name it this afternoon consciousness. It's consciousness that goes from one state to another. Now, what is consciousness? Consciousness is being, or a being who is conscious. Everything that is a being. That sounds very simple, and in fact it is very simple. Something that is a being, whether it is a star or a planet or an atom, or an animal, or a human being, or whatever. It is a being, and it is conscious. It is a consciousness. Everything is driven or controlled by an intelligent force, which we call consciousness. So consciousness is actually the same as life or intelligence. You may say, well, if you call it life or intelligence, I still don't know what it is, because what is life then? Seems a very easy and simple question. However, if you look on the internet, you will find not less than 20 definitions, and maybe more, of life, and none of those definitions meet us. However, there is one description of life given by the old Greek philosopher Plato that is very useful for us. Plato says that anything that can be moved by itself is a living being. Every living being acts and reacts, and it can be the object of action. Well, look around you and you will perceive that everything changes, everything moves, everything acts and reacts and is the object of action. So, according to Plato, and we agree with it, everything lives. Everything is consciousness. Now, you cannot react on another if you don't perceive one another in one way or another. So consciousness, you must say, is also a form of perception. You perceive or you sense other living beings. There are, of course, many different forms of perception. Physical perception is maybe the best known to us, but there is what you may call sensory perception. You enter in a room or in a house or in a restaurant and you feel immediately at home or at ease. Or the country, you don't feel at home at all. You sense a strong aversion. For us human beings, the main form of perception is thinking. That may sound strange, but thinking is in fact perceiving thoughts. If our communication is all right, then you perceive the thoughts I'm sending out to you. I'm sending them and you will receive them. What then is self-consciousness? Well, self-consciousness is observing oneself, perceiving oneself. Consciousness that reflects on itself. You look in the mirror, you observe yourself, not your body, but the one you really are, your consciousness. Babies cannot look at themselves. Yeah? Neither can animals or plants, or at least most animals cannot. And if they can, they do it in a different way than we humans. Well, we human beings, we are consciousness, and that consciousness goes from one state, one phase to another. It dies in one state and is born in another state. It dies as a toddler, is born as a teenager, and so on and so on. And when we are old, we die in this state we call life, and we are born in a state that we call death. And then we die in the state that we call death, and we are born in which we call life, and so on. We call this the cycle of life and death. All beings manifest themselves cyclically. All consciousness, whether it is a star or a planet or a human or whatever, even a thought, because thoughts are also living beings, manifest themselves in a certain period of time, which we call life. It appears into the world, and then after some time it disappears. In other words, periods of activity are followed by periods of rest, and those periods are followed by periods of activity, and so on. So the cycle of life and death means that the state that we call life alternates with the state that we call death. It's like the ebb and flood of life, night and day. There is a constant alternation of rest and activity. Now, you should not think that a cycle means pointlessly turning around in circles. That's not the case. Because in the periods of activity, the periods which we call life, there is growth, an increasing of consciousness. A cycle is not a circle. Compare it with a screwdriver or a spiral staircase. You go in circles, but you go up in circles. Nature gives us a beautiful illustration of this process. Every new spring, the trees are the same as in the previous year, and yet they are something different. They have grown. And this fact, the growth of consciousness, is actually the answer to the question we have to answer in this presentation: can life be without perspective? It is the growth of consciousness that gives meaning to life. More and more expanding our consciousness, gaining more understanding, more insight, more awareness of the interconnectedness of all beings, that makes life rich and worthy to be lived. And we can always continue with expanding our consciousness. Well, if we talk about the birth of a human child, then there can never be an absolute beginning, just as death is not an absolute end. There are relative starting points and ending points. And for us, living in the state we call life, birth is a relative starting point. Exactly when we wake up, there is a relative beginning, a new day. That new day, however, is the continuation of a series of days. Thus, every new life is the continuation of a series of lives, a chain of lives. Of course, not every life is the same as the previous one, because, as we said, cycles are like a spiral staircase, and you go up in circles. And you may wonder how long that process is going on, and how long will it go on. Well, our premise is boundlessness. Boundlessness, however, is not understandable for us. We are limited beings. Although we are essentially boundless, we are, as manifested beings, limited, and therefore we cannot fully understand the boundlessness. But we can use it as a starting point, as an axiom, just like mathematics is based on axioms. And if you look from the standpoint of boundlessness at the issue whether life can be completed or whether life can be without perspective, then the answer must be no, that is not possible. How can boundlessness ever end? There's always more, there's always greater consciousness possible. Later on we delve deeper into this topic. Are there any questions up till now? No questions? It's a pity that the ones who are looking on the internet now can ask their questions. They can ask their questions, writing us an email, and we will answer them, but not at this moment. Well, let's go on. Boundlessness. In the boundlessness, worlds or beings come into life. They grow and they disappear again. There is a coming and going of universes, stars, humans, animals, plants. It is this process that we call reincarnation. Literally, it means becoming flesh again. You become a body of flesh again. In fact, it is only true for animals and humans, because they have bodies of flesh. But everywhere in nature, you see this process of re-embodiment. It's a universal process. Everywhere are cycles, day and night, ebb and flood, the 4 seasons. Sometimes the cycles are so big that we do not recognize them as such. And sometimes they are very, very, very tiny, the cycles of the atoms, for instance. Even thoughts return cyclically. Well, the period of activity alternates with the period of rest. You can see that clearly in the states of waking and sleeping, but the same in death and life. There is an ancient Greek proverb that says, Hypnos and Thanatos are twin brothers, sleep and death are twin brothers. The process of sleeping and dying is exactly the same, although the body remains intact when you are sleeping, and by that the body disintegrates. But the adventures of the consciousness, as we may call it, are in both cases the same. In both cases, consciousness goes from one state to another because, as we said before, consciousness passes through periodic phases of rest and activity. But that consciousness is not something fixed, something that is forever and ever the same. And it is not homogeneous. Stronger, it is composed. I'll give you some examples. If you read the newspaper and you're worried about the wars in other parts of the world, then you are another ego than when you see a picture of a young elephant, for instance, and when you solve a math sum, then you are different than when you're cheering for a goal in a football match. And if you unselfishly help somebody, then you are different than when you try to score points by your boss, and so on, and so on. In short, there are different egos, different forms of consciousness in one human being. Different eyes. Human beings, therefore, consist of different qualities of consciousness. And different religious systems, philosophical systems, divide a human being into 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 aspects. And the best known classification is the one of St. Paul, of the Bible. And human being is spirit, soul, and body. The eternal part, the lasting part, the spirit, the soul, the learning part, and the body. In Theosophy, the classification in 7 aspects is often used. It's not contradictory to the division of St. Paul in spirit, soul, and body, but it gives more details. And you can combine those 2 formats, and then you get this picture. You see spirit, soul, and body, but with more details. The spirit consists of Atman, the inner God, the divine part, Buddhi, the lightning part. You all know, of course, the word Buddha. Buddha is somebody who identifies himself completely with Buddhi. Manas, the mind of the thinking principle. And then you have, in the vehicle side, Kama, desire, Prana, vitality, the Linga Sharira, the astral part, the model body, it is called here, and the body of flesh and blood, the Stula Sharira, it's the Sanskrit word, Stula Sharira. Well, the interesting part of this format is that Manas, the mind, is divided in 2 aspects, a higher Manas and a lower Manas. And the lower Manas is in our language, the personality, the personal consciousness, the personal ego. It is the consciousness that is characterized by the feeling of separateness. The idea that you are separated from others. The personal man says, I am different than other people. The higher Manas is the individuality, We call it the reincarnating ego, the real human being. The lower manas is the mask. It's the role you play in this theater which outer life is. And the word person is derived from a Latin word, persona, which means mask. Now in each new reincarnation, the higher manas, so the reincarnating ego, puts up a new mask. Yeah? A new mask to play a role here on earth. The real man, the higher manas, is the actor. The personality is the role he plays. Well, let's take a closer look at that cycle of life and death. And let's start with the dying process. What happens when we die? Well, consciousness doesn't die. Impossible. Cannot die. It has always been, and it will always be there. Dying means that the consciousness gets rid of what we call the building blocks. Yeah, the atoms, the living building blocks that build up the vehicle. Yeah, those principles which are drawn in the square. Oh, sorry, it's too quick. Too quick. There are several building blocks, physical building blocks, the atoms that build up the body. Then there are desires, kama. Yeah? There are feelings, emotions, lower thoughts, all belonging to the lower manas. When does physical death occurs exactly? Nobody really knows. Nobody knows exactly when someone has died. Usually it is assumed that when the last breath has been blown out, or shortly after the last heartbeat, a person has died. However, in order to allow organ transplants, the term brain death has been coined. But does brain death mean you're really dead? There was a case of a pregnant woman who was brain dead, according to the doctors, and whose baby in her womb could grow and be born after 9 months. Can you imagine that? She was declared dead, but the baby in her womb was alive, and after 9 months was born by a cesarean section. In the Netherlands, the Advertising Code Commission objected, therefore, to the advertisement for registering as an organ donor, because it said that the organs were taken out of your body when you're dead. But you're not dead, you're brain dead. In Denmark, there was a girl who had also been declared brain dead, and when the doctors wanted to take her away from the respiration, the machine, to get the organs out of her body, she began to breathe independently, and now she is a healthy young woman. Brain death is not death, no doubt about that. In fact, you can only determine with certainty when the body begins to dissolve that somebody has died. Anyway, during the dying process, consciousness withdraws slowly. It withdraws from the ordinary state of being into a more inner, a more spiritual state. Yeah, it withdraws to the more inner worlds. And the first thing that consciousness then experiences is what we call the panoramic vision. And what do we mean with panoramic vision? Well, the dying human sees all events of the just ended life, beginning with the first thoughts when he was a baby or toddler, to the last thought just before he dies. As in a parade, one perceives all events, one sees those events and those thoughts in a very bright light, you understand why certain things have taken place. You grasp the reason why something has happened to you or why it did not happen to you. This panoramic vision is so clear that you cannot compare it to anything here on Earth. The technical explanation for this fact is that the lower manas becomes temporarily one with the higher manas. It seems as if you look at the life of another. You do not identify yourself with the person who just died. You are temporarily the higher manas, you are the reincarnating ego, and you look at the personal life you have lived. Without remorse, you see the mistakes you make, and without pride, you see the good things you did. Yes, spiritually, men and women can observe the causes of former lives, which resulted in the circumstances of the last life. You understand that this panoramic vision is incredibly important. Man can learn his ethical lessons, draw his ethical conclusions. He takes those conclusions with him to the resting state of death, and there they are interwoven into his consciousness. You may wonder how long this panoramic vision lasts. Well, it takes several hours. It begins shortly before or shortly after the last heartbeat. It does not take so long for spiritual people because they have learned to observe themselves objectively and need therefore less time to observe their last life. That is one of the reasons why we advise to observe the events of the day before you go to sleep. Recall your thoughts and actions of that day before you fall asleep and draw your conclusions impersonally. That is a very good exercise to lift your consciousness to the higher manas. Everyone who dies, everyone has such a panoramic vision. Demented elderly. The question? Yes?
How we can know that that is true, because the people who are dying cannot tell us, yeah, that there is a...
Sorry, can you repeat it? I could not understand it. The people who are...
How we can know that the panoramic vision exists, yeah? That people who have seen it, they are dead, so they cannot tell us about that. Yeah?
Well, there are some, that is not a real panoramic vision, but there's something who had a near-death experience. They tell us the same. They see all the events of their life beginning with by birth and ending before they die. But that's not the real panoramic vision, because the real panoramic vision is still more clearer than that one. But there are human beings far more advanced than we are. We call them the Mahatmas or the Masters, who don't lose their consciousness at the moment of death. And they have scientifically experienced all those things, yeah, and they have noticed it, and they have given it to us by means of their messengers like H.P. Blavatsky, and that's why we take it as a hypothesis, yeah, and look if it is a logical doctrine, so we can study it, and maybe we can come to the conclusion that it is really true. So we present you all those thoughts after the panoramic vision, also the post-mortem states of Kama, Loka, and Devachan as a hypothesis, and you for yourself have to conclude whether it is true or not. Okay. Yeah? But if it's logical, if it answers your intellectual aspect, but also your spiritual and emotional questions, then you may presume that it may be correct, it may be true. And maybe it will take some years for you to conclude, well, in fact, I perceive now the truth of this doctrine, yeah? All right, good question. So, panoramic vision. Everyone, we say, has a panoramic vision. So elderly people, mentally handicapped ones, people in coma, etc., etc. Well, it's extremely important, especially when you consider the fact that after the period of rest, which we call death, human consciousness reincarnates again. And thanks to that clear vision of the life you have lived, you can change your thinking patterns in a new life because the spiritual conclusions you have drawn from the panoramic vision is assimilated into your consciousness. Well, after that panoramic vision, there is a blissful unconsciousness. Nobody dies consciously, unless, and that is the answer of your question, nobody dies unconsciously unless you are a Mahatma, a master of life and death. Yeah? But for normal people, there is unconsciousness like a dreamless sleep. But when you are asleep, you can come to some form of self-consciousness again. Then you are dreaming. When you die, it's actually the same. You can come to some form of self-consciousness, or rather, different forms of self-consciousness, and you may call these states dreams, by lack of a better word, but sometimes they can be very, very real. And the first of those dreams, or rather those states of consciousness, takes place in what we call kama loka. Dying is the release of the building blocks, the living building blocks. And because a human being is a composed being and is made up of building blocks of different characteristics, that process of releasing the building blocks, or letting go the building blocks, takes place in a few phases. Well, first of all, the physical atoms are released, and after all, the body dissolves quickly and the atoms go their way. Then we leave our feelings, our emotions, our desires, and our lower personal thoughts behind us. And that takes place in what we call kama loka. What do we experience of this process of dissolution? It depends on how we have lived. It depends whether we have cherished many or few desires in life, and what kind of desires did we cherish. For the average man and woman, kama loka resembles a train journey of a half-sleeping passenger. He is drowsing. Sometimes he opens his eyes and sees the landscape, but after a while he closes his eyes again. People who have cherished very little desires go through it very quickly. In certain cases, so quickly that they are hardly aware of it. People with many and gross desires stay longer and perceive more. You wonder what kind of consciousness it is. Well, if you want to form an image of it, you must try to determine what kind of desires most people have. Are those desires not often selfish? How many people try to satisfy their desires at the expense of others? All these desires form the world of desire, kama loka. And in short, without wishing to go into details, it's not a very happy world. But don't be afraid, most people travel quickly and half unconsciously through it, like in a vague dream. There are cases, however, in which people stay longer in Kamaloka. Well, I'll try to explain this. Every person has a certain amount of life energy, a store of vitality. Actually, you cannot die until that store of vitality is exhausted. However, the body, the vehicle, may be damaged in such a way that it cannot be any longer a proper instrument for the consciousness. So the body dies. It dies before the store of vitality is used up. Such is the case, for instance, when somebody of, say, 40 years dies in a traffic accident. Such a person will remain the time that he would have lived on Earth if that accident had not taken place in Kamaloka. So say that he would have lived for 80 years, then he stays for 40 years in Kamaloka, but in an unconscious state, like a dreamless sleep. That period is exactly equal in length to what would have been the normal term of life of the living physical body had not death from accident occurred. Cases of suicide and executions, however, are different. Also in those cases, the deceased remains the time he would have lived on Earth in Kamaloka, but now in a conscious state of more or less conscious state. He's aware of the world of desires, but he cannot change his situation. You may compare this state of consciousness with a nightmare that repeats itself again and again, and you cannot escape. Especially when people have committed suicide by cowardice, they get into such a situation. But we have to be aware of the fact that every case is different. And we have to take in consideration also the fact that the last thoughts before you die are essential and determine to a large extent the conditions after life. For example, take the case of war, of dictatorship, and a freedom fighter has been captured by the enemy, but such a man is afraid that he would betray his comrades when he is tortured and therefore commit suicide. Well, that is, of course, a complete different case than a politician who is arrested for fraud and who cannot bear the fact that he is the object of scorn and ridicule and therefore kills himself. The suffering on earth may be very heavy. People may therefore want to die. But beware of the fact that the same suffering continues to exist after death, when you committed suicide. And actually the suffering is even heavier there, because here on earth we have always the possibility to try to solve our problems and to change our situation. But in Kamaloka, we have to undergo the suffering, living in a world we don't know and in which we cannot take any initiative to end our pain. However, there is no perpetual hell. The life energy, the store of vitality, will be exhausted at a certain moment. And therefore, whether you die of old age, illness, by an accident, murder, suicide, there will come a time that you have worked out the status of Kamaloka, and then there is something we call the second death, with a second panoramic vision, but this time slightly less clear. And then you get in a state that we call Devachan, or at least you can get into that state. What is Devachan? To begin with, it's not a location, it's not a place. Devachan is a state of consciousness. So basically, you can have anywhere that state of consciousness. The word itself is derived from Deva, God, Chan, world or land, so the divine world, and that indicates a blissful state of consciousness. It's a state of consciousness in which the spiritual aspiration of a human being that he has built up during his life on earth are elaborated. You have to see it like this. The coarse, personal man cannot live in spiritual spheres. Only what is noble, only what rises above the personal can experience something there. So the impersonal ideals you cherished in life, the spiritual aspirations, the wonderment about nature, and so on, all those spiritual thoughts have the right characteristic to go with the human being into Devachan. And those spiritual aspects of one's consciousness will come to full bloom there in that state. In this regard, H.P. Blavatsky speaks about the aroma of the personal human being. Only that aroma can taste the bliss of Devachan. So everything that rises above personal consciousness and which belongs to the atmosphere of the higher manas has its Devachan. Does every person have the same Devachan? No, of course not. Of course not, because every human being has other spiritual wishes and ideals. The musician who has sacrificed everything for his music during his life will hear the most beautiful melodies and harmonies and create the most beautiful music. And the nature lover makes beautiful walks in nature and observes all the living creatures there. The mathematician will discover the most beautiful formulas, and the loving mother is surrounded by her children, whom she sees growing up harmoniously. Everyone lives with the people he loved. He loved impersonally. And thus, in that way, the spiritual lessons are interwoven into our consciousness, so that it becomes a part of the human being. It becomes a part of yourself. And the man or the woman who did not have any spiritual tendencies, who never thought about life after death, and who denied dogmatically that there would be a life after death, has no Devachan at all. He's unconscious, like in a dreamless sleep. Do we really live in Devachan with our loved ones? No. Although Devachan is a state of spiritual consciousness, it's also an illusion. That illusion, however, is so real for the one in Devachan that he considers it as completely as a reality, a far greater reality than anything on earth. It's even so real that you cannot compare it with any state of consciousness on earth. This seems strange, but we make our own reality. When we grant reality to something, then it is real to us. That is one of the most important lessons of our course, Thinking Differently. There's another very important thing we want to say in relation with deceased and living people, and that is that in our most inner self, in Atman, we are never apart. In that defined part, separation does not exist, because everything is one. So even if your loved one is gone, be sure that in your inner self, you are always with him. And we can realize that, at least to a certain extent.
Sorry, I have another question. That is about Devachan. In Devachan you find only dead people or also the people who are alive, they have a part in Devachan?
Well, I try to explain that actually you find nobody there, because the people you meet there are projections of your own consciousness, and you find everybody you loved on earth impersonally. So the mother who loves her children and her husband impersonally will be in a complete harmonious situation with her children and her man, but not really the man and the children, because it's an illusion, it's a projection of her own consciousness, but for her it is a reality. Yeah? And that's why I said that everybody who has spiritual ideas lives in Devachan with the culmination, yeah, of his spiritual ideas, and that's why the musician lives with music, and the nature lover lives in nature, and so on. But it is an illusion. It's a projection of your own mind, the spiritual parts of your own mind projected, just like I project this slide here. Yeah? And you may grant reality to that slide or not. And you grant reality to that slide because it comes out of your own consciousness, and that's why for you it's a blissful, happy world, because you think it is reality, although it is an illusion. That's the state of Devachan.
In a movie that you see it.
Exactly.
People are not there.
So it is 100,000, a million times more realistic than a movie, even a 3D movie. Yeah, but there are very different stages in Devachan. The lower stage begins just above Kamaloka, not in the sense of the place, because I said Devachan is not a place, but in the sense of characteristic, just a little bit more noble than Kamaloka. That's the lower stage of Devachan. And the highest stage reaches to the self-conscious stage of Nirvana. And Nirvana, where you sense the unity of everything, is only accessible for the most advanced among us, the Buddhas. So even in Devachan there are many grades. And I think the higher the grade, the more you perceive some kind of reality, and the lower the grade, the lesser you perceive the reality of it. Yeah?
Does that apply to the masters as well? Because you said the masters, they retain their consciousness when they die. Is it nevertheless an illusion, Devachan, for them too?
No, because they don't have any Devachan. Because they have... yes, they perceive the illusion of Devachan, and that's why they don't have any Devachan. If they have a rest period, it will be one kind of form of nirvana. Yeah, because everybody has to rest. So a master of a Buddha, his rest will be a self-conscious state that we call nirvana. And in nirvana there are various grades also. Thus I think they will be in the lower grades of nirvana, or at least in a state where they can self-consciously live. Yeah? It's just like a fairy tale. Yeah? You may grant so much reality to a fairy tale that it's a reality for you, a truth for you. But if you perceive that this is just a fantastic story, you don't believe in it anymore. So the masters don't believe in Devachan anymore, and they rise above it. And so they don't have any Devachan. Yeah? Well, maybe one thought. How long, because that's a question we always have, how long does Devachan take? Eh? Well, in general, there are many exceptions, but in general you can say that if you have had many spiritual aspirations, Devachan lasts longer than if you have a few spiritual aspirations. Yeah, that's logical because then you have more spiritual energy to work out. The relationship with other people also plays a role. You can come back to Earth earlier because you have a close relationship with some people who are already manifested on Earth. Or people who are still dead and have the Devachan, and in that case, it may be a reason to stay longer in Devachan. There is another reason why you can have a shorter Devachan, and that reason is compassion. That sounds contradictory because compassion is a spiritual attribute, but if you have a lot of compassion, yeah, the will to help others, you come back earlier to serve your fellow man. Compare it to somebody who sleeps just 4 hours a day so that he has more time to help his fellow human beings. Anyway, Devachan lasts much longer than life on Earth. H.P. Blavatsky and also Gottfried de Perucker, the Theosophical teachers, speak of about 1500 to 2000 years. That seems a lot, but in Devachan itself, there are no clocks. Yeah? Time doesn't exist in Devachan. Time is related to manifested things, to planet Earth, for instance, that rotates around the sun in 365 days, or that revolves around its axis in 24 hours. But in Devachan, Devachan is a state of non-manifestation. So nothing, no time can disturb the happiness there. Anyway, the moment comes that the spiritual energy has been used up. There is a moment of awakening for the dreaming man. He wants to go back to Earth. And after the break, we will tell you that story. As a summary, we will show you this slide. Activity, life on Earth for us, the physical sphere. Then we die. We have our panoramic vision. We let go our lower thoughts and atoms, the building blocks. Then there is the second death. Then there is Kamaloka. This takes place in Kamaloka. Then there is the second death, and we have our blissful rest in Devachan. And then we will come back. But this side of the circle, I will tell you after the break. All right. Any questions? Wow, I think I make it within an hour.
It's a crucial question because my question is why the people want to extend their life, why they don't want to die at the moment that is coming. They do a lot of things to go to doctors, do all kinds of medical treatments to postpone their death. Yeah. Is there an explanation?
I'm going to tell you that after the break, but you may answer that question for yourself. Attachment. They have no ideas about what may happen after death, and they stick to the outer life. They think that the outer life is the only life there is, and so they are attached to it. That's the reason. But I'm going to tell you more about it after the break. Yeah?
Thank you.
The panoramic vision and the simulation of these spiritual lessons, is that a form of memory?
Yes, yes, yes.
Can you...
It's the memory of the dying man. So every thought, every act you do is somewhere registered in your consciousness. And Helena Blavatsky gives some very beautiful examples of it. Even if you don't know it yourself, yeah, you forgot it, it's somewhere in your consciousness, it's written down, so to speak. And every little thought, every little action is therefore within your consciousness. And when you die, all those thoughts, thoughts are living beings, all those events in your life is just like are rolling out, and you watch them. You should like you watch to a movie, and you see all those thoughts, all those events in your life, and you see why something has happened. You see the cause, and then you see the result. And if you are very spiritual, you see the cause of a former life. Yeah, because also the events of former lives are somewhere in your consciousness. And that's the reason why that panoramic vision is so very important, because actually it is the only moment a human being lives in reality. Because when we live on earth, we live in the illusion that this life is everything. And when we are dead, we live in the illusion that the images from our own mind is the reality. And the only moment that a human being can observe the reality as he is the panoramic vision. And that's one of the reasons why the Mahatmas in their letters say, let there be silence when a person dies. Because that moment is so important, because he can draw his ethical conclusions, and that can give a totally different direction to his next life. So the thoughts you had when you were 3 or 2, well, I cannot remember them, maybe you can, but they are in your consciousness, and when you die, you will see them. And you will see why in a certain phase in your life, when you were 50 or 40, something happened, maybe an illness, or maybe somebody died, or you lost your job, or whatever. You will see that there is a cause in your own life which resulted in that situation. And you will see it, you will perceive it, you will know it. And the most important is that you will perceive the justice of it. Yeah? It is justice. It is right that it has been like this. So that's very important. Very important. Yes, please?
If you do cremation, that's the right word in English, will not disturb that...
No, because that process takes place in, let's say, 3 hours for the very spiritual human being to 6, 7, 8 hours. So our advice is, when a person has died or is dying, in fact he is not really dead, but the heart ceased to stop, ceased to beat. So let that person for about 6, 7, 8 hours in peace. Don't disturb it. Go out of the room. And after 8 hours, he's dead. You have just a vehicle without any life. And then you can cremate it if you want.
The panoramic vision is over.
The panoramic vision is over. And then the best thing is to clean up the vehicle, so to burn it, cremation, and let the dying in peace. Don't think too much of it, because that will be an attraction to the earth. Let it be. It's good. He's happier than we are. Yeah.
Maybe it's good to emphasize a little bit more, because she was using the term memory, and quite often we think in memory that we are more thinking on the physical memory, but we should realize that this process is taking place on the higher part, and it is above the physical spheres that it takes place. Mm-hmm. So that is the thing we have to take into account, because otherwise everybody thinks that it is a part of the normal memory process, but it is not the case.
Yeah. In fact, there's one question once asked Gottfried Perucker, what happens when somebody dies in a car accident and the body is burned? Does that person have a panoramic vision because the brain exploded or is burned or whatever? And the answer is yes, he has a panoramic vision, because on the astral plane, all things will pass in the same way, and maybe even clearer, because the brain is not really the the place where our memory is located, but in fact our memory is everywhere in nature, and it's only the focus of our consciousness to remember something or not. So everywhere you can have a location where you where is the stock of your memory. Yeah? So it's not a physical process. It's a process of consciousness. There is a case Blavatsky tells us in the 19th century. There was a doctor, and now it was not a doctor. It was a lawyer who had a daughter who suffered sleepwalking, somnambule. How do you call it, somnambule? And once he robbed, she didn't know it, an important paper of her father. And then it was a very important paper, and it gave a lot of suffering for the father, was very important. And then 50, 60 years later, when she died, or the moment she was dying, she screamed, "I stole it." And she had stolen it without knowing it, because she did it at night when she was walking, sleeping. So even if your personal ego didn't notice something, it is somewhere in your consciousness noticed, written down. Yeah. So it's very, very important that panoramic vision. Because even when you know it, you don't know it, your personal ego doesn't know it, there is something in yourself that is more spiritual, more the real man who knows it. Cup of tea? All right. Yeah? All right. Second part. In the cycle of life and death, we ended up before the break with that blissful state of consciousness which we call Devachan. But there will come a moment when we wake up from that state. The spiritual energy has been gradually used up, and we want to return to the things we left behind on earth, things that were not worked out yet, seed that has not sprung up yet. How does this birth process occur? Now you should realize that the consciousness of man, of the reincarnating ego, has withdrawn in the divine part, in Atman, the divine part of the human hierarchy, and man has dreamed his spiritual dreams in Devachan. But the energy is used up at a given time. All ideals have been elaborated, and there is, as it were, no more spiritual things to consume, to ruminate. And there is an urge in the consciousness, a thirst. In Sanskrit it is called Trishna, and the Buddhists speak of Tanha, but it means thirst. A thirst to return to what we left behind. And just like you want to return home after a long vacation, there is an urge in the resting man to return to manifested life. Remember, sleep and death are twin brothers, and when you are sleeping, there will come a moment that you wake up, even if you didn't have set your alarm clock. Maybe you wake up a little bit later, but you wake up. It's the same when you're dead. In that state, there also comes a moment in which you wake up from the spiritual dreams you are dreaming. It's good to realize that thirst for manifestation is fed by one's own attractions, which were built up in a previous life. Often people wonder why they were born, and you also hear regularly, "I didn't ask to be born. our reaction is always, oh yeah, is that true? Theosophy teaches that it were your own attractions that brought you here. And these attractions may be of various kind. They can be fed by antipathy or sympathy, but they always come from within you. There is no God outside you, there is no doom, no fate. There is no coincidence either. It's your character that you have made up yourself, and you made it because of the choices you made in a previous life, that will be attracted to the circumstances that you will encounter in your new life, that will be attracted to the persons, such as, for instance, your parents. Compare it again with sleep. You can wake up with a nice thought, sympathy, because you go on holidays. But you can also wake up with a nasty thought, I have a very difficult meeting today at my job. But the attractions always come from yourself and are originated in the previous days you have lived. It's exactly the same with the attractions that wake you up from death. They originated in the previous lives you lived. Now, in the resting consciousness, there is an urge to return to the outer world. But that consciousness cannot manifest itself. It cannot begin to gain experiences on earth. And why not? Because it has no vehicle. It has no instrument to do that. The only difference between sleep and death is that while you are sleeping, the vehicle remains intact, and when you're dead, it falls apart. Human consciousness looks like this when you are in Devachan. Not literally, of course, you're not a triangle, but you don't have in Devachan a vehicle that you can use to gain experience on earth. The reincarnating ego makes an atmosphere out of itself, an atmosphere according to its own character, an atmosphere that is focused on the outer world, because the reincarnating ego has the desire to return to that outer world. We humans always create such an atmosphere around us, therefore we feel attracted to some people and not to other people. That atmosphere evokes corresponding vibrations in others, and that's why we feel a kind of sympathy for people, or not. In that way, the atmosphere of the reincarnating ego awakening from the spiritual state of Devachan, attracts elements, live atoms we call them, or building blocks, but living building blocks. There are all kinds of building blocks, thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires, all the building blocks that a human being left behind when he died. And this process in which the reincarnating ego attracts the building blocks he left behind is called emanation. Emanation means outflow, and usually it refers to the fact that a hierarchically higher entity, higher on the ladder of consciousness, develops from itself a being that is less developed. But in fact, such an entity creates an atmosphere in which other beings can manifest themselves, beings attracted by that atmosphere. And in that way, the reincarnating ego creates an atmosphere to which the live atoms are attracted. And what kind of live atoms? Well, exactly the live atoms which he had left behind when he died, and with which he had worked in a previous incarnation together, yeah? And who made up his constitution in his last life. First of all, he attracts the higher life atoms, and then the stream of consciousness arising from the reincarnating ego descends more, and it approaches the more material spheres. That atmosphere emanating from the reincarnating ego forms here also a field of attraction. You may compare it to a magnet. And all life atoms belonging to that atmosphere, the atmosphere of desires, of lower thoughts, emotions, are attracted to it and are forged into a unity that can serve the human consciousness as a useful instrument. And in this way, the manasic and the kamic and the pranic life atoms are attracted due to the magnetic effect that goes out from the reincarnating ego. And finally, the stream of consciousness reaches our physical plane, or actually it reaches the area that is something more ethereal than the physical plane, and that we call the astral plane. The astral plane is the mold of the physical plane. So it's the mold of the substance, the matter, as we know it. The linga sharira belongs to that astral plane. And the physical body is in fact nothing but the sediment, the lees, the deposit of the astral. It is compared to the dregs in a bottle of wine, the sediment of that wine. And in the same way, the physical substance is the sediment of the astral. In short, when a human is born, there is first the astral body, and then there is the physical body. I would like to emphasize that these processes take place unconsciously. The reincarnating ego does not consciously attract all those live atoms. Actually, there is only one moment when the reincarnating ego is self-conscious, after he leaves the blissful state of Devachan and before he becomes a self-conscious being here on earth. And that moment is the so-called panoramic vision. In the same way as there is, when a man dies, he has a retrospective of the past life. He has a preview of the life he's going to live just before the new reincarnation. How is that possible? Well, on the basis of the causes you created in your own previous life, you can have a preview of the effects of those causes in the future. And you see, so to speak, the causes in their stage of effects. And the most important of that vision is that you realize that what's going to happen is all right. You know that your future life is due to yourself. Everyone is the creator of his own life. You made yourself. And then the stream of consciousness finds a relative endpoint in a male sperm and in a female oocyte. And the conception between man and woman takes place because, as we all know, for the building up of the stula sharira, the body of flesh and blood, a husband and a wife, a man and a woman is needed. Well, the two ends of the stream of consciousness, the two poles of that stream come together. The reincarnating ego has made contact with this physical world. Questions? All right. Then there is the growth of the embryo. So, before the growth of the embryo, a lot of things have happened already. The birth process starts long before the embryo begins to grow. The growth of the embryo is a mysterious process that can be observed thanks to modern technology, but which is still full of riddles. Cells divide 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on. But how can unspecified sex cells, the most universal cells, produce specialized cells? Where does this differentiation come from? For all those other cells are specialized. How can those cells, lung cells, heart cells, tissue cells, blood cells, and so on, originate from those unspecified sex cells? How does such an unspecified cell know that it needs to specialize? Well, the answer is in the linga sharira, the astral body. For the astral body is the template or model of the physical body. And it's the pattern around which the physical body is slavishly molded, atom by atom, cell by cell. And behind the linga sharira is the reincarnating ego, the one who has, so to speak, commanded to build the vehicle. And after 9 months, the baby is born. However, the birth process has not yet been completed because all characteristics, all abilities, all talents already developed in previous lives must be reactivated. The education plays a very important role in this process, and we would like to talk about it, but our time is limited. But at least I want to say this, that we should realize that a child is a full-fledged human being. It's an old colleague who has to be incorporated in life on Earth again. All old characteristics must be redeveloped, and that happens in this sequence. First, the physical principle is developed, then the emotions, the feelings, vitality, then the child gets his own will, at the age of 6, 7, and then at the age of 12, 13, the child or the youngster, the teenager, perceives that the world is different than it should be. That's the moment the Buddhic aspect is involved. This inspiration, intuition, insight, idealism, and then the highest aspect, the Atmas aspect, or the inspiration will come to activity. And after 21 years, a human being is more or less the same as in his previous incarnation, not entirely, however, because he has undoubtedly grown in his previous life. Well, we said it already, dying is being born, and being born is dying. The child dies, and the adolescent is born, the teenager dies, and the adult is born, and the young adult becomes the middle-aged man, and then we become older ones. And now we want to say something about this final stage of life, which has everything to do with the title, Can Life Be Without Perspective? There are now discussions about what one calls a completed life, with which is meant one has lived his life and there is nothing left over to live for. Then there are people who talk about self-determination, that you should have the freedom to die whenever you want. Euthanasia, so they say, is a human right. But can life be completed? As mentioned before the break, if you assume boundlessness, boundless growth, life can never be completed, of course, because that would mean that there is an end in boundlessness. But we also said that there are relative starting and ending points. Being born is a relative starting point, and death is a relative end point. Could it be so that when that relative end point approaches, that you consider your life as being completed? We On this we also say no, that is not possible. And why not? Every life phase had not only its own learning moments, but it is also caused by causes created in earlier phases of life or in previous lives. And in one way or another, you cannot escape that, its harvest will have to take place. And that means also that every stage in life, how painful they may be, has its own moments of learning. Actually, you have chosen for those moments, otherwise you would never have come into such a painful situation. Well, what do we see happening when the process of aging approaches? You see very often that the law or principles in our constitution, the one which are drawn in the square, which normally operate as a unit, begin to detach from each other, which makes our lower part unstable. Of course, I don't tell you anything new when I say that the body becomes weaker when you get older. In fact, that process of decay of the body begins already just after your 21st year, and when you are 60 or 70, you cannot do a lot of things you could do when you were 20 or 30. But certain feelings and emotions and desires also lose their importance. The short-term memory often works less. The focus shifts to more spiritual matters, and therefore the more physical-orientated issues lose their value. And you know, that's a blessing. That's a big blessing, because the spiritual matters are much more important. They belong to the spiritual side, the lasting part of our consciousness. It's much sadder when attention is focused on earthly things. Attachment to those external things leads to grief. Look, the issue of the so-called completed life has different sides. People who are no longer capable to physical activities sometimes find their life worthless. But when you focus on spirituality, you have a life to win. It's extremely important to learn to relativize. That leads to wisdom. And if elderly people are capable in doing so, they can teach young people an important lesson just by being there. But you may say, many older people become demented. Some call dementia a terrible disease. Well, dementia may have several causes, but there's always a kind of disharmony. There's always an imbalance. The higher aspects of the human being have already been retracted and actually have died already. So, in a certain way, it's a normal process. However, you don't need to become demented. If you keep the interest in life, if you live a harmonious and spiritual life, then you won't become demented. At least the chance to become it is much smaller. I had a colleague who, when he was 50 or 52, always said, well, I've had it. I'm not interested in new developments, in a new method. Let it be like it was. Well, if you don't use your intellectual and spiritual aspects, they die. Use it or lose it. Of course, we don't judge anyone who is demented. You never know exactly what the cause is, and the cause may come from former lives. The decline of the brains is not the cause of dementia, but sometimes the result of the withdrawing of the consciousness. That is shown in the cases of what is called terminal lucidity. In those cases, elderly people who are sometimes demented for many, many years, become bright again just a few days before they die. I know a case in which a mother didn't recognize her daughter for many years, and just before she died, she recognized her daughter, but she knew everything about her. If dementia is really the degeneration of the brains, then she would never recognize her own daughter, because brains do not recover suddenly. What do demented people learn, you may ask? But I can ask, what do we know they learn? From the standpoint of theosophy, you may be sure of one thing, and that is that they will have their panoramic vision. They will see the causes which resulted in dementia. They may draw their own conclusions. What about euthanasia for demented elderly people? Is that wise? Well, in the case of euthanasia, the causes that led to dementia have not been eliminated and will result in an equal situation in the next life. And what do those humans experience in Kamaloka when they end their life before the stock of vitality is exhausted? Do we know that? In addition, we don't recommend the reverse, that you continue to attach to life. Sometimes you wonder why people still take a chemo, knowing that they can stretch their life for a maximum of, let's say, 4 or 5 months. Of course, we fully recognize the free will of every human being, and of course, everyone must make his own choice. But if the idea of reincarnation was more familiar, if people could see the beauty of this doctrine, then they knew that dying is just a temporary farewell. And they knew that you should always harvest what you have sown. But also that love, impersonal love, is much stronger than death, and that we will always meet our loved ones again. Because in the core of our heart, we are always together, because we are all one. And therefore, death is a relative end. And see old age as a preparation for that relative end. See old age especially as the harvest time, the autumn of life. If you have lived spiritually, have been living in compassion, then old age is the most auspicious, the most blessed, and the most spiritual time. Sometimes you are physically inactive when you are old. The body does not want to function anymore, but spiritually you may still be very alert and very vibrant. And death then comes like the evening dusk, very gradually, very calm, very peaceful, very blissful. And the journey that the consciousness is going to make to spiritual spheres is a wonderful adventure. Have you cherished your selfish and cross desires, perhaps even trampled over others? Then old age is not that nice, because then remorse and attachment to life, fear of death will spoil the last days of your life. But even then, maybe, even more than, you can learn something. There is a wonderful story of the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy. It's called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan was a man of the world. He lived for his pleasures, but suddenly he became ill. Probably it was cancer, but that disease was not known in the 19th century. But anyway, he visited doctors and he suffered terribly. He suffered terribly. But the people around him know he would die. But nobody said anything. Hypocrisy, yeah? They hoped he would die soon because he was annoying them, yeah? And his colleagues were already thinking about how to take over his job in the office. Only a small young boy was true and compassionate and tried everything to alleviate Ivan's pain. And then, suddenly, just a few hours before Ivan died, he sees himself through the eyes of others. And then he realizes that he has only lived for himself. And at the same time, a great sense of love towards his fellow human beings begins to arise in him. And he doesn't feel pain anymore. And he's not afraid of death anymore. Because, as Tolstoy writes, in the place of death there was light. Imagine that euthanasia would have been committed on Ivan. Then he was robbed from this amazing spiritualizing experience, probably the most important experience of his whole life, which would give his new life a complete new direction. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is no completed life. Life is consciousness. Consciousness is movement. Growth, change, movement never stops. Nothing can stand still. Nothing remains the same. And if you look for the last time at this cycle of life and death, we see continued motion. Yeah, you let go your thoughts and your atoms when you die, and then you are born again and you recollect your thoughts and atoms, and that goes on and on. But you grow. Yeah, life is a spiral staircase. You become increasingly more wiser, and you experience the unity of life. And last but not least, you can learn that compassion is, or should be, our main motivation, the driving force of life. If you consider such an image of life, then can it be without perspective? Well, I think you may answer this question for yourself. Thank you. Any questions? Please.
Thank you for the lecture. You spoke, among other things, on dementia and the withdrawal of the higher faculties of man. And that the best is to prevent it by staying alive and alert, and as a 90-year-old still being out in the world and enjoy and have love. Do you think, from a theosophical perspective, that it is possible to have a cure for dementia, which strikes maybe 1 in 5 or 10 Dutch or elderly citizens above 85?
Well, I think the best is to prevent becoming dement. I know a guy, he's died already 25 years ago. He died when he was, I think, 70 or something. But he was, in his mind, a boy of 18, 19 years old. Everything he saw was new. Yeah, he discovers every day a lot of things, a flower, you know, an article in the newspaper. Everything was new for him. Well, such persons will never get demented, I think. So if you have those interests in life and in your fellow human beings, and you are working for them, trying to be compassionate and stay in the world in order to help your fellow human being, I think you will never get demented. Or maybe there is a cause of a former life, which resulted in this life in that state of dementia. Well, I think the best thing when you already are demented, and that is for the people who are around it to realize that you are not talking with a human being anymore, because the family is suffering, but they say, daddy is not daddy anymore, or grandfather is not grandfather anymore, but daddy is already dead for a big part. Yeah, a lot of aspects of daddy aren't here anymore. So try to realize that. At the same time, I think the family and all the people who are working in that field should try to activate as much as possible the interests in those people. And sometimes they can do that by songs of the time they were young, or by other kinds of activities, in order that they can at least to a certain extent be active in this world. And there are some nice experiences about that. I know it. I knew some people who work there. But sometimes you fail, and then you're just dying. And then we have to be patient, and a certain moment the stock of energy is used up, and the person will die. But don't suffer because of it, because if the demented person doesn't suffer, why should we suffer? Try to take care of them, put them in a loving house, in loving circumstances, and try your best to activate all the things they can do. And that's it. Don't make a problem of it.
I have another question concerning the reincarnating ego that you spoke about. You also said that the universe has a manifestating side and a side in which it withdraws. What is behind the reincarnating ego? Because I would imagine that the individual having a reincarnating ego, as you said, is endowed with intelligence and a whole lifespan and a vision at the end, and another second vision and a panoramic view before the life starts. So I imagine Theosophy being a stream of consciousness pouring out eternally, that there is also a spiritual unit behind the reincarnating ego.
Oh yeah, there is. There is. Well, you may say that the personal ego, so in my case that is Barend, and in your case it's, is the instrument of the reincarnating ego. Yeah? But in the same way, you may say that the reincarnating ego is not the end, but is also an instrument of some entity, some consciousness, which is far higher developed than that reincarnating ego. Yeah? And that entity, you may call it the Buddhic entity, is the instrument of an entity which is still higher developed, the inner God. And that entity, and so on and so on. There is no end. And in the same way, we may say we expresses ourselves, we as personal ego, in an entity which is much less developed than we are, and so on. So in boundlessness, there is no beginning and no end. So for us, the reincarnating ego, the higher manas, is the entity or the consciousness who is above our normal daily consciousness. And I hope we can activate the forces of the higher manas a lot in our lives, because that makes us real human beings. But that is not the end, because the higher manas is not the end, because there is something still more developed, and so on and so on and so on.
Do I understand it correctly then, that the inner God that you spoke about is not subject to this law of reincarnation, of the reincarnating ego, but is a steady entity, a higher entity, that is behind and overseeing the whole course of lives of a reincarnating ego?
Yes, and on its own level, on its divine level, has its own adventures, his own struggles, you may say, his divine struggles, it is divine victories and so on. And it's not a human being, it's not a human nor a female. That divine being will develop also on his divine plane. Yeah? But you may call him the Father in heaven for us, the Son, and we are, so to speak, a sunbeam, yeah, which becomes more material, till a relative endpoint. But we are all one, and we are all on our own level in a process of evolution. So we as a human are trying to evolve our manas, our thinking capacity, our mind, and the divine part in us, the inner God, on its level is being to develop its divine properties, and so on, and so on. And what we call Atman is for us a relative endpoint, but there is something which is called Param Atman, which is still higher than Atman. And is that the end? No, because Param Atman is sometimes called Brahma in Sanskrit, and there is something which is called Para Brahma, and so on. Yeah?
Now you go very fast.
Very fast.
You jump from...
But it's good to think about it, because then, if you think about it, then you prevent the idea that there is Almighty God, or there is an end point, or an end in evolution. No, there is no end in evolution. And at the same time, every human being, but not every human being, every being, every consciousness is an aspect of that divine being. Every being is useful, is a part of it, and you can do without it. Everyone, we need everybody. Nobody can drop from that hierarchical system, which we call the universe. All right.
You can compare it with the building blocks in our body, the atoms, and we, the manasses, the thinkers, are the inner God for those atoms. Can you say that?
And at the same time, we are the building blocks, in a way, for that divine beings,
Yes.
which we call the divinity of the sun, for instance. Yes, that's right. Yes, please.
You speak about attractions and about consciousness, but what are attractions? And my problem is that for Mahatmas they have less, they suffer less from attractions, they are more above it. So what's the difference? Yeah? The people or persons who are less developed, they have a lot of attractions. Mahatmas, they have few attractions.
Well, we all have attractions. You have attractions to Theosophy, that's the reason why you are here. And other people have attractions to sport or to, everything. But the attractions comes from within yourself, And you may change your attractions. If I look at my life and I was 20, I had other attractions than I have now, So in my next life, I will be different than in this life because I have developed my attractions, my interests in things. So, and that's a question of free will. Nobody is obliged to have attractions to a certain kind of thing. No, you are attracted to it because you want to go to it. You like football and you go to a football match. And if you go to a football match, you can't go to a Theosophical lecture. So you feel more for sport than for Theosophy at that time. Well,
you tell how it works, but not what it is.
But it's your own free will that make the choices. There is no God who says, "Van, you should this or you should that." It's your own free will. And sometimes, after a while, you discover, like Ivan in the story of Ivan Illich, that the attractions he had for pleasure, for drinking, vodka and friends and so, that those attractions actually lead to suffering. Yeah? And then he realizes that it should have been better if he wasn't attracted to those things, but to more spiritual things, more working for others, cooperating with others. And that's an important lesson. And sometimes, and it's not necessary, we have to enter in painful situations in order to realize that we have to change our life, but it is much and much better to, in advance, change our life in order to avoid difficult situations and painful situations. And well, we recommend compassion, unselfishness, impersonal love, because that is the normal way of living, because the universe is built on love. Yeah, love is the cement of the universe, the Peruka says. Yeah, impersonal love, compassion, the law of laws. So we should try to copyate that in our lives, yeah, to imitate that in our lives. Then we work with nature. And if we go against nature, then we have those attractions to selfish things, which eventually will lead to suffering. But it's the free will of every human being to choose whatever you want.
So, by your will, you can also control the attractions.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. Yeah. And it's very easy. But don't forget, if you have, let's say, put for 20 or 30 years energy in a kind of attraction, and thoughts are living beings, just by one decision, those attractions will not cease to exist. Because then you have that fight, which is called in the Bhagavad Gita, the fight between of Arjuna, because the inner struggle, the jihad, the inner jihad, as the Muslims call it, then you have that strife, because in one hand you have the attractions to your former life, you want to leave, but those attractions are still there, the thoughts will come back to you cyclically, and then you have the new ideas. And then it depends on you how strong you are. If you can focus on your ideas, yeah, and live spiritually, and live in cooperation with others, well then, slowly, those attractions to those other things will disappear. Not in one day. No, that's impossible, I think. But slowly, you will develop other attractions, and at a certain moment you will look at your life and you cannot understand why you was attracted to that kind of things, because you've grown and those attractions don't do you anything anymore. Last question? No? Okay. Then we end with an invocation to our higher self, to Atman, the inner God, or our divinity, or whatever you want to call it. And in this invocation, it's called the golden sun. But the golden sun is this an aspect within your consciousness, the relative highest aspect of your consciousness. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and treat it to those distant calls of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.